Over here again with another short video. This week, or today at least, we're going to be talking about closers, something that we didn't really get enough time to go over in class. So I wanted to take some time to go over closers, which is what Trimble calls them. We also know them as conclusions or concluding paragraphs. And I find that a lot of students struggle with conclusions. You've written your entire paper and you're kind of trying to figure out, okay, now that I've done this whole thing and said everything I need to say, what else do I need? And for some people it feels like an add-on or feels forced because we've been taught what? Conclusion, you restate your thesis, summarize your evidence. But I think there's really more to it than that. So we're going to talk about that today, about how to create strong conclusions, and it'll be kind of an overview, so it won't be super in-depth. We'll also look briefly at the handout I gave you in class on strong and weak conclusions, and we'll talk a little bit about those as well. Also going to give you a short mini lesson on semicolons, which I've seen a lot of people struggling with recently. So, without further ado, let's think about why we struggle with closers. And again, I think it has to do with we feel like we've said everything. We feel like we can't really say anything new, and restating the thesis sometimes feels like, well, my audience already knows my thesis. So the chapter on closers in Writing with Style starts with this epigraph by F.L. Lucas. And Lucas said, "The most emphatic place in a clause or sentence is the end. This is the climax. And during the momentary pause that follows, that last word continues, as it were, to reverberate in the reader's mind. It has, in fact, the last word. One should therefore think twice about what one puts at a sentence end." Now, even though Lucas is talking about a sentence end, really it's very, very similar. The thing that we put at the end of an essay is the thing that's going to resonate with the reader. And one way that I like to think about this is that conclusion should kind of be like a pebble that's stuck in your reader's shoe, and they're going to continue to it's going to continue to bother them, or they're going to continue to think about it, right? The last thing that you want after 5, 6, 8, 10 pages of writing is for your reader to set it down and say, that was nice, and move on. If we're thinking about what we want our reader to know, to do, or to believe at the end of something, we've been making a case, and we don't want them to simply just move away from it. So this is like the closing argument, right? And Trimble uses this analogy in the sort of court case. So we've presented all our evidence, we've done all the heavy lifting, and now it's just time to make that closing statement to convince our reader that we are right, or our course of action is correct, or whatever your goal has been. So one way that we often think about the structure of an essay is by what we call the preacher's maxim, which I may have mentioned before in class. And this is a way of saying the general setup of an essay should be tell them what you're going to tell them, which is your introduction. Tell them, which are your, comprises your body paragraphs, and then tell them what you told them, which is your conclusion. It's a little bit reductive in my opinion, but it's a good way to sort of think about the basic structure. So according to Trimble, there are 3 imperatives. On page 45, it says, focus on your main point, which may be your final point. Gratify us with at least one new twist or phrase to make your point memorable, and end with emotional impact. Now, we're working with research essays, academic research essays, but that doesn't mean that they have to be devoid of any sort of emotion at all. In fact, hopefully in 101 or in other English classes, you talked about ethos, pathos, and logos. If you didn't, don't worry about it. I'll add a little snippet onto the Canvas site, and you can go look at ethos, pathos, logos, that triangle. But emotional impact is something that draws a reader in. When you think about times that you are most inclined to act, it's probably when you have felt some emotional connection with something. Likewise, if we go to suggestion number 2, gratify us with at least one new twist or phrase to make your point memorable. And some of you picked up on this and mentioned it as a thing that you liked about this chapter in this week's or last week's reading quiz. What's a new way to think about this? What's something that maybe the reader hasn't thought about yet? Now, note that this is different from adding brand new information, which is something we do want to avoid, and we'll look at this in the examples in a moment. Focus on your main point. Again, the longer the essay, the more likely it is that your reader will have forgotten exactly what your main claim was. Now, hopefully, those topic sentences and various signposts throughout the essay have reminded them what the main focus is. But we want to make sure that we end the essay with that telling them what you told them. Right, reminding me or your reader of what they have just read, right? So some do's and don'ts. Do be careful about your conclusion. Craft it as carefully as you can. Do consider that your reader has stuck with you this long. Really, if you remember, the easiest thing for a reader to do is to stop reading, then you owe them kind of a debt if they've stuck with you this long. Now, for English 102, I have the great privilege of reading all of your essays, but that also means I'm somewhat obligated to read your essays. So I don't really have the option of stopping to read your essay, or ceasing the reading of your essay, right? So if you're going to take your reader into account, you're going to take into account the time that has taken them to read 10 pages, say. Gratify them. Make sure that you are still showing them that you're valuing their time, right? Do consider the closing appeal, again, just like the court case, drive that point home, and definitely make it as powerful as your opener. I'm a big fan of thinking of each part of an essay as something that could exist in isolation, but is stronger with all of the other parts along for the ride. The introduction, for example, should be able to stand on its own without all of the support that follows it. It's just that the support that follows all those body paragraphs makes that introduction stronger. Now, some things not to do. Please, please, please don't start your conclusion in conclusion or to sum up or some other such silliness. Not only is it a pet peeve of mine, but it is kind of a general pet peeve in academia. The reason for that is it comes across as seeming somewhat formulaic and somewhat like weak writing. Well, that sort of thing might have been okay in a previous English class or even in, say, a speech or debate. It's really has less impact or is less effective in an academic research paper, especially if you're going to go on to write academic papers in the future for other classes. Don't introduce new information is the second thing not to do. And really what we're talking about there is don't bring something brand new to the table. If you have some other great piece of evidence, it should be in the body paragraphs, not thrown in at the end. And it's kind of the same thing as beginning or ending a paragraph with a quotation. Right? It's a little bit like that dating Superman annoyance from the reading earlier this week. And don't miss the opportunity to leave a lasting impact. Again, if you kind of think of that last paragraph as the pebble in the shoe of the reader that's going to kind of continue to bother them or going to kind of continue to give them something to think about, if you miss the opportunity to have that lasting impact, then you've kind of lost part of the battle, right? Remember that your objective is to convince your reader of something. You need to know something, do something, or believe something. So let's look at this conclusion here. So I'm going to do a little evaluation of this one. So, in conclusion, it says, it is clear that people read apocalyptic narratives simply because you want to imagine a world in which you can recreate your identity. Mad Max provides an example of a film in which a character is able to recreate his identity. While the main character Max was a cop in the previous world, he is now a lone wolf. Perhaps all narratives allow us an opportunity to reimagine yourself in a different world. There might not be any difference at all between romantic comedy and an apocalyptic narrative. It's all a matter of individual taste. Now, hopefully, as you look at this or as you listen to me read it, you think, wow, there are a couple things in there that make this not necessarily the strongest conclusion. First of all is this bit where it says, in conclusion. I can probably get rid of that and start my conclusion simply, it is clear that people read apocalyptic narratives simply because they want to, there's a grammatical error there, to imagine a world in which they can recreate their identity. And the reason that we're saying they is because we're talking about other people. Okay, so I can take care of that in conclusion part. I'm going to assume, if this is the conclusion of an essay, that the author has already talked about Mad Max, and they're kind of summarizing this, how they saw the connection between identity and apocalyptic movies through the example of the Mad Max film. Now, if that's it though, we haven't necessarily summarized all of the information here, and it seems to me like there's some missing information about what this student would have been talking about example-wise in the paragraphs above. One of the weakest parts of this is actually the last sentence. And I'll just read it again here. So it says, there might not be any difference at all between a romantic comedy and an apocalyptic narrative. It's all a matter of individual taste. Well, I've just undermined my entire argument by saying that. By saying, oh, well, really, it all is kind of up to individuals. It doesn't really matter. That is one thing that I see students do occasionally, where you're trying to be open-minded and kind of zoom back out. But what you're doing there is, as I said, undermining your entire argument by saying, well, I know I've spent the last 5 pages talking about apocalyptic narratives and how they're unique, but now I'm going to end with my very last sentence saying that maybe there is no difference at all. If, on the other hand, my paper had been about how similar romantic comedies and apocalyptic narratives are, then that would be a different story. But for our purposes here, I hope you can see that that's actually something that's weakening my overall argument. Okay, so you had the packet of conclusions, and we're just going to kind of go through them relatively quickly. There are a couple that I want to look at more in depth. So the first one, let me get back to my, is, again, it starts in conclusion. It's very short, it's very brief, it's not really telling us a great deal. So that one is, I hope you can quickly identify as weak, as using kind of stock phrases. The second one, you can see already, is much longer, much better. It does start with a quotation, but that quotation is an aphorism, right? It's a phrase, which might be suitable here. It's not, I don't know, I go back and forth on this one personally. I think it works here, but as a general rule, starting paragraphs, especially conclusions with quotations, is inadvisable. The official answer says it restates the thesis and widens the scope. The third one is okay. The fourth one begins with a clear statement and ends with an analogy, which, I don't know, for me, this isn't necessarily the strongest, and I say that because it comes across to me as if all it's saying is science sometimes happens by accident, which, I mean, maybe it does, but it depends on the paper that came before. The fifth one is definitely weak, and hopefully you can kind of see the comedy in this. And I'll read this one out. Tolstoy's War and Peace is a very long novel with a great many characters. If Tolstoy had not been able to make the characters stand out from each other and seem real, this book would have been difficult to follow. As it was, the novel was a pleasure to read. I don't know if any of you have read War and Peace. It's not my favorite novel. But when we look at this is really more like a book report than it is an essay on, say, the techniques of characterization in War and Peace, right? All it's saying is it was a pleasure to read. It had a lot of characters, right? So again, probably far too short and far too brief. 6, they say is pretty effective. I've had students kind of debate on this one, whether or not it's really that effective. What I do think is effective about this is they're clearly moving from one small example to looking at how this might be an implication of larger problems in the world. Number 7, obviously, is a very weak one. Again, this is like the Mad Max example, ends with history will never know who is right. So again, at that point as a reader, I'm thinking, well, why did I read this paper? 8 and 9 are definitely probably the two strongest here, and I would suggest maybe looking a little bit more into those two if you need a good example of a strong conclusion. 8, in my mind, is probably the strongest of the 10 here. Closing a school that has strong ties with the community it serves can have deleterious economic and social effects on the whole community. That seems to be recapping the overall thesis. To avoid such harmful results, many school boards have managed to keep schools open and yet balance their budgets by trimming all unnecessary expenditures. That's probably a piece of evidence that they used. Most notably, they have cut administrative costs and they have provided innovative programs. That information is probably also backed up in what came before, and hopefully they've gone into more depth and detail about that. And then we get a final sort of, again, kind of tie back to the thesis. Trustees should consider their options very carefully before they walk the political tightrope of closing schools. And then 10, I'm going to read out just because I think it's funny. It's probably the funniest one in my opinion for a couple reasons. So it says, the poor relationship between Diefenbacher and Kennedy governments of the early 1960s was, as we have seen, caused by complicated political and historical factors. It has just occurred to me that the characters and the backgrounds of Mr. Diefenbacher and Mr. Kennedy, one a Baptist and the other Catholic, one of a modest and the other from a rich, influential background, might have had as much to do with misunderstandings between the governments as any political cause. Okay, so a couple things I find funny here. The author is trying to use this rhetorical device of saying, it has just occurred to me. Well, that's kind of silly in an essay that you've written and rewritten and edited and researched, right? It hasn't just occurred to you. It may have occurred to you as you were writing it, but now that it's occurred to you, you can actually do something different with that information. The other is, whatever the paper was about, which was about the complications of the poor relationship between these two, the sudden occurrence to the to the author that it had to do with the backgrounds of the presidents, relative presidents, is actually probably more interesting than whatever they wrote about. So to say that, the Baptist, Catholic, modest, and rich, influential backgrounds, that could be its own paper. So they've kind of derailed themselves here, which is how they explain it in the answers. Okay, so as far as conclusions go, again, I sort of recommend, well, not sort of, I do recommend, look back at that conclusions paragraph, or closers section of Writing with Style. Look at the 10 example conclusions that you've got here, and at the additional conclusions on the part of that same packet that I handed out in class. Will all of this make you an expert at writing conclusions? No, we're still in the process of learning how to write conclusions, and some of you maybe have a kind of more of a knack for it than other people, but we can always be stronger at them. In that, know that as your paper develops and as it changes, your conclusion is one thing that will probably change a great deal as well. So it does depend on what information you add or subtract to body paragraphs. Okay, I want to do a quick semicolon mini lesson because a lot of you have been using semicolons. They're tricky to use, but I think that we can really quickly go over how they work, and I hope make it nice and easy. So the easiest way to think about how to use a semicolon is to think about whether or not you can substitute a period in there. A complete sentence is something that we also call an independent clause, which means it is much like an independent person able to stand on its own. It's not needing to lean on somebody else. So the first example here, Joe went to the store, period, he bought a hedgehog, period. 2 independent clauses. Joe went to the store, perfect, independent. He bought a hedgehog, perfect, independent. As a side note, a dependent or an incomplete sentence might read, Joe went, or went to the store. Those lack some component of being an independent clause. Now notice that in example 2, all I've done is change the period and switch it to a semicolon and change that capital letter to a lowercase letter. Joe went to the store, semicolon, he bought a hedgehog. I'm all good there. If I wanted to, I can use number 3, and I can use that semicolon with a transition word, right? Like so, Joe went to the store, semicolon, however, comma, they were out of hedgehogs. If you're going to use a word like however, therefore, furthermore, something like that, number 3 is the model that you want to use. If you look quickly at 1 and 2, these are ways that you would not want to use a semicolon. Joe went to the store, semicolon, and he bought a hedgehog. So that's incorrect because and he bought a hedgehog is not an independent clause. It is not going to stand on its own, right? And number 2 is just silly, right? Joe went, semicolon, to the store and bought, semicolon, a hedgehog. So if you need more clarification on semicolons, come and see me. This is really just a mini lesson to get you thinking about it, what you need to have if you're going to use a semicolon in a stylistic way like this. Really, there's no reason that you have to use a semicolon. Some people see them as pretentious, some people avoid them. The only time you absolutely have to use a semicolon is in a larger list of things where it might be otherwise confusing which things went together. And I'll put an example here up on the screen for you to look at. I didn't prepare one because I didn't think of it until just now. All right, so that's that. I will see you all in class Wednesday or Monday or Wednesday or Monday or Wednesday or whenever I see you in class. And it depends on when you watch this video. The secret word for today is consternation, and I will also put it up on somewhere around here. All right, have a good one. I'll see you in class.